Hello, welcome to An Abundance of Books. My name is Julia and today we're doing my October wrap-up. You will notice that the setting is a little bit different with the changes that I made to my room recently. This bad boy had to move into my bedroom, corner of the bed here, but it felt wrong to change location with only, I guess, 3 more wrap-ups in the year, so I decided to just film it in here. October was actually a really great reading month for me. I just have really fond feelings about everything that I read. Not all of it was 5 stars, but I read some really interesting and thought-provoking things, and I feel like I have a lot to talk about. It is one of my lower reading months. I've got 7 and a bit things to talk to you about, so we can get into it. The half thing that I have to talk to you about is Babble by Kuang. I started this in October, and I've made it to the yellow marker. I realized wherever it happens that this is separated into 5 parts, so I put markers at all of those parts, and I just made it to part 3 this morning, and it's going really well. It's a very good book, but it does kind of read like a textbook. Like, it's very slow, very thought-provoking, but like there really isn't much action happening, but I am really enjoying it. It's just something I'm gonna have to take my time with, and at the pace I'm going, if I read a chapter every day, at least 1 chapter, I will finish it by the end of November, so that is my goal. It's really excellent. I could see this not being everybody's personal taste, but you can't deny the quality in here. The other thing that I don't have much to say about is Comfort Me with Afros by Catherynne and Valente. I guess I do have a lot to talk about, but I made a whole separate video for this. It's linked in the description and up above if you're interested. This is going to be in my top 10 of the year. Right now I think it's in the #1 spot. It's so hard to say, but I absolutely love this book. It's a tiny little horror book. The audiobook is 2 hours. I read it in 1 sitting. The writing is beautiful, and it is very much a story that I connected with. I'm not giving you any more than that. It's so short, like I can't talk about it, and that's why I had to make a whole dedicated like 20-minute video for it. The other huge hit this month was Books of Blood by Clive Barker, a book I had 0 expectations of and ended up loving. So the thing with this that is also kind of wild is it's a collection of short stories. And I didn't know that. Like, I know it's a bind-up of 3 books, but it's like 6 short stories in each volume, and there's 3 volumes. I ended up only reading the first one because I was running out of time in the month, so I justified it. And also because the stories aren't long, like they're not hard to get through, but I am not someone who can read short stories back to back to back. Like, they're very high concept. I need a minute to decompress before I can compress for the next one. So I read the first 6 and they were great. Like, this is truly incredible. The quote on the back here by Stephen King says, "What Barker does makes the rest of us look like we've been asleep for the last 10 years. And like, yeah, couldn't agree more. This was written in 1984 and it reads super modern, super accessible. There's definitely some, you know, gross stuff about women and minorities, but less so than a Stephen King, I would say. I also didn't know that Clive Barker is openly gay, so I think that impacted it, and one of the stories does feature a gay couple. It is a horror book, so like, don't expect them to have a happy time, but they were in here, which was nice. And the thing that's so interesting about this collection is they have such different tones. Like, there are some that are really scary and upsetting. The first story, The Book of Blood in particular, is challenging. But then the one immediately after that, the one immediately after that one, The Yattering Jack, was like a odd couple story about this man Jack and the demon who has been assigned to haunt him. And it was so much fun. Like, it definitely had spooky parts, and like there's a demon in it. It fulfilled the horror requirement without being scary, and that's just like such a skill. I am obviously like a big dummy here. Clive Barker is a huge name in horror. He's done so much stuff. Book of Blood, the first volume, is his first published work, but he's written plays before. He has comic books, films. Like, the man does everything, and it's super impressive, and I am fully converted and will be reading a lot more of him in the future. Is there anything else I want to say about these? It was interesting looking up the reviews. The ones that I loved, people didn't seem to love, which were like the less horror-y ones. And the last story, In the Hills, the Cities, that one, I understand why people love it. It just really didn't work for me. It's very imagery based and I never really got on board. And the other one that people hate, Sex, Death, and Starshine, that is about a company putting on 12th Night. It's hard to know what's a spoiler in this, but basically they're putting on a play and also there are zombies. It's a great story. Just the writing in here is so good because spooks are subjective. Horror is very subjective, but quality writing, no. And Clive Barker's got it. So I'm giving this book 5 stars and I'm going to be slowly making my way through the other books in this bind up. I don't know if I'll talk to you about them, but you can check my Goodreads for once I've done that. Speaking of Clive Barker, I have Clown in a Cornfield, which I mentioned in my TBR. It's blurred by Clive Barker. I didn't realize. An author who knows how to make us afraid. Yeah, this book is excellent. I am so glad because I've been in love with this cover ever since it came out and it does not disappoint. I also really appreciated how much this book is truly just about Clown and Cornfield. That's the majority of this. This is about our main character Quinn, who has to move into this new small town with her dad, who is the new doctor, and she falls in with a ragtag group of kids. And they're doing the Founders Festival, I think, and clowns and bad stuff starts happening. This one is really tough to read. It is very clearly real-world commentary. Like, I prefer my horror to be a bit more metaphorical, but this they'll just like straight up say their motivations. And the other thing that just personal taste for me, the clown in this isn't a Pennywise clown, it's a guy in a clown suit. It worked for the story, it just wasn't my expectation going into it and not what I generally prefer. But this is so excellently done. I think the writing is really strong and there's a point where the action starts and it truly does not stop. The last 2/3 of this probably take place over an hour or two and it's just like thing after thing after thing, and it's really gory. Like any type of campy death you can have, it's in here. And this is allegedly YA, but it gets real gross in a way that I loved, but was also hard to read because these are teenagers. But I thought that this was excellent. There is a sequel. It definitely leaves itself open for it, but in like just the epilogue. If you don't want to read the sequel to this, just don't read the epilogue. I don't think I'll be picking up the sequel just because of my expectation with it. The clown not being a clown isn't for me, but I would highly recommend this book. I ended up giving it 5 stars. Let's talk about a book that I have very complicated feelings about, Youre Invited by Jayatissa. This book is so difficult because I called it from very early on. And actually, I didn't call it. My husband called it. He made like a dumb joke and I was like, wait, that might actually be something. And yeah, turns out this is definitely not the kind of book where you can predict everything though. So there are twists and turns along the way. It's about our main character going to the wedding of her ex-best friend and her ex-boyfriend. And there's a ton of mysteries happening in here. It's a really interesting story. I think my problem is because there were so many mysteries introduced and I felt they were fairly obvious, I just wasn't as invested as I would have wanted it to be. But like objectively, so many things about this book are great. Particularly, it is set in Sri Lanka and the atmosphere around it is great. The way that they talk about behavior in different social situations, how our main character is one end of that and her ex-best friend is the other end of that. The other thing that's really great about this is in between each chapter there are interviews with guests at the wedding. So it starts at the end where we know that the bride is missing and then jumps back to like 3 months before or something. And then there are interviews by the police interviewing all of the guests at the wedding, and they do a lot of inserts of like what they actually thought about the bride, what their suspicions are. It does a lot of character building for all of these side characters too. I thought that that was really excellent. My big problem with this book, I think, is that there are twists for the sake of twists, which I don't love. I think maybe they should have played it a bit more straight and gone for more character study stuff than mystery stuff, but I can't deny how excellent it is. It's slightly too long too, and there's a perspective shift about halfway through that I didn't love, that kind of brought the pacing to a halt. It's super interesting. I just would have reworked it a little bit. I didn't have the best reading experience, but I do think that I had very fond memories of it. So I'm ending up giving it 4 stars, which I feel bad about because like it is better than Clown in a Cornfield, but I liked Clown in a Cornfield more. Then I read The October List by Jeffery Deaver. This is something I've been excited about forever because it is a book told backwards, and truly it is a book told backwards. Like you could fully flip this thing. It starts at like chapter 30 and goes backwards. It's a cool gimmick. For being a gimmick book, it pulls off the gimmick pretty well. But the problem with a gimmick book is you know it has to do certain things in order to pull off what it is. And this was also just like really challenging to read. I don't read a lot of men, and there are a lot of mentions of our main character who is a woman. It's not all from her perspective, but she's a large part of it. She's hysterical a lot and crying, and attitudes toward women and minorities again. Like it was just really tough to read, and you're like, wow, this thing must be super old. No, 2013. Like Books of Blood was in 1984, and it had nothing close to the level of grossness that I felt in The October List. Also, The October List is ironically set in September, and it just felt very bloated. Like it didn't need to be as long as it is. Like for the structure like that to work, you know, I don't want to say too much, but like you know there has to be a twist at the end, which is the beginning. So you're kind of reframing it to figure out how we could get here, but still have an interesting story. Which I don't think is too much to say. Like, the nature of this book makes you have to think about it all the time. Like, you are analyzing this plot constantly and being like, where are we? Where are we going next? How did we get here? It invites you to ask those questions, and the answer to those questions ultimately isn't satisfying. Reading all of the misogynistic stuff in it wasn't super fun. I'm glad that I read it as a gimmick book, but as a book, it just wasn't for me, and I give it 2 stars. Which I felt very justified in by my next read, Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister. Because this was sold to me as a Groundhog Day book, but it is not that. It is a backwards book. Our main character witnesses her son stab this random man she's never seen before, and then the next day she wakes up and it's the day before, and then she falls asleep and it's the day before that, and it's super interesting. But she is actively time traveling. This is still a linear story from our character's perspective. She's just time traveling, so you still get the feeling of the gimmick of a backwards book, but in a way that makes a lot more sense and that has more compelling characters and more interesting stuff. And it was really good. Honestly, the best way that I can describe my critique of this book is it's a Reese's Book Club pick. They all kind of seem to do the same thing, like a vague mystery, very heavy on the mom stuff. Like, I get it, but is it what I want to be reading for 400 pages? Not necessarily, no. But this book was super good. She's discovering the mystery along the way, figuring out things about her family that she never knew. It all unfolds in a really interesting way and is so satisfying in the end, and I really enjoyed it. It's a 4-star, again, for the Reese's Book Club quality of it and being too long. I think all books are too long though. But yeah, this one I would definitely highly recommend because it is a true mystery, and I love the way that the facts that you get can really only come about by going into the past. It's really cool. I would definitely recommend it if you are a big mystery thriller person like me and you've read all the big standard stuff. this is really good. The last book that I read was The Romantic Agenda by Kann, someone I've actually never read anything by, and this was fine. This book is hard because I'm trying to figure out whether my critiques of it are valid or based in bias for me, because this is a romance with an asexual main character, not a romantic just asexual. I just kind of found it not as satisfying as a romance with an allosexual character, just like when you can't have sexual tension that like affects it. But I think that it is still something important for me to read and think about why I feel that way. But I think the big problem with this book too, I think the author did a good job of it, but it's very tell and not show. The author justified that well by having our main character be like just a very open and honest person, and like she's just fed up with having to explain herself all the time, so she's just like direct and honest to a fault. So working that into the character's personality I think was a good choice, but it doesn't leave all of the subtlety that you might look for in a romance. And the whole book is kind of one big miscommunication trope, and like addressed, because how could someone who is so honest and direct have a miscommunication trope so bad? But they talk about it. I thought that it was a really interesting story, but I don't think that the romance really worked for me, and a lot of it was just sort of fleeting. Like the scenes were nice, but the sum was less than the whole of its parts. What? And again, like I do recognize that a lot of this could just be me coming from where I am. I just think it needed like some editing and some restructuring, because I really liked it. Like the characters were all good and you got a good sense of them. It's about this trip to a cabin in the woods, and like they go to a winery by helicopter. It's all very cool and very atmospheric. It just, you know, lacked the oomph for me. I feel like I've been saying oomph a lot. So there you go. Those are the 7 books that I read this month. A lot of really good stuff, a lot of really interesting and thought-compelling things. I think that I did spooky season justice, and I've got some goodness to carry me through to November. Thank you so much for joining me. Let me know if you have any thoughts on these books that I've read, if I've swayed you into any of them. There's some really quality stuff here that I would recommend. And that's it. I'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. So I come back in after filming, and guess who's here? You're a little late, aren't you, buddy? At least you're cute.